Big round of applause for you guys.
Good morning, and thank you, Matthew, for being here with us today. As it was mentioned many times today and also yesterday, there are a lot of questions and uncertainties in Brussels when it comes to understanding the medium and long-term impacts of some of the announcements that the Trump administration made. In some ways, but also it seems like this administration had very clear the fact that it's strongly committed to an America First agenda. So what does America First mean when we look at the US domestic policies? Is it a cohesive strategy, and how is it different from the previous Trump administration?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful space, and thank you all for coming. And first, just a word on my authority to talk on this topic. You know, Washington is a small town. I am a card-carrying Republican, so a lot of the people going into the new Trump administration are friends and colleagues. And it was rumored in Politico last night that one of our fellows is the front runner to be Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, so maybe somebody you'll all be dealing with much more. So what is America First? And I think it's a sense that over the past few decades, American foreign policy has been on autopilot. A lot of American engagement in the world hasn't tied back to direct American interest. And so as Secretary of State Marco Rubio put it when he looks at US policies, he wants to ask, in every case, how does this affect the average American? How does this make them more secure? How does this make them more prosperous? And so I think we've seen that philosophy already in place in the past few weeks. So another administration, when they look at the international security environment, they might look at the war in Ukraine or China as the biggest challenge. Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, has said the border is the top challenge. And if you look at public opinion polling, Americans are more worried about border security than they are about Ukraine. Second, foreign aid. There's been this pause on foreign aid, possibly shutting down or significantly reorganizing USAID. And I think it was the same philosophy, looking at some of the programs, sponsoring, say, drag shows in Guatemala and other things. Wait, how does this affect the average person? Is this how they want their dollars spent, or could they benefit by having it spent in some other way? So I think it's pretty straightforward. Again, America First, how does this affect the American people, and is it improving their lives?
Yeah, so you mentioned foreign policy now. Since 1944, the US and the European allies have played a fundamental role in shaping the international rule-based framework from institutions like the United Nations, NATO, the WTO, agreements on non-proliferation and bilateral treaties. This system has been central for global stability. Can this system, which you also in previous interview described as the most consistent and successful grand strategy in international history, can this system be coherent with an America First agenda? Can they coexist? And if the US is not as involved as it has been, what does this mean for the effectiveness of this system that we have had in place?
I think I'd make a few points to that. One, I think that the terminology rules-based international system, you'll probably hear less from the Trump administration. That doesn't mean that a lot of their policies are not consistent with that. I think you know, staying in NATO, which I suspect they'll do, is consistent with a rules-based system. But often in Washington, when you get changes of administrations, they like to also change the terminology to show that they're different. The Biden administration talked a lot about the rules-based system, so I suspect we'll hear about it less under Trump. The next thing I'd say, I think there's a view, especially with President Trump himself, that the United States has borne too much of the burden of international leadership over the past few decades. To use his terms, that the United States is getting ripped off. And so I think there is a desire for other countries to step up and play more of a role. And so when it comes to Europe, alliance burden sharing within NATO has been a clear theme there. When it comes to Ukraine, what more can the Europeans do to help? When it comes to trade, is this really fair and reciprocal trade, or can we get a better deal for the American people? So I think that'll be a theme. And then finally, the press sometimes reports that they're isolationist and that they're skeptical of international agreements. And I think that's not fair. I think if you look at the first term, it was a very internationally engaged policy, meetings with Kim Jong-un and use of military force in the Middle East, so I don't think it was isolationist. And when you look at their approach to institutions, I think it's a pragmatic one. So I think there are times where they look at agreements like the Climate Paris Accord and say, no, we don't think this is in our interest, we're getting out. But in other cases where they are interested in agreements, so nuclear non-proliferation treaty, for example, remained in place. The first Trump administration renegotiated and negotiated new agreements. And Trump has expressed an interest in new agreements, including peace agreements with Ukraine, a new Iranian nuclear deal. So I think it's more of a pragmatic approach, and again, tying it back to, not agreements for their own sake, but does this benefit the American people?
But do you think that this also means that these bodies need to be adapted? Like, what does it mean if the United States is not as involved? Is this a good moment for other countries to push for a adaptation of these bodies? Can they, or could they exist even if the United States has a different approach within those institutions?
Well, I think it's, even apart from the Trump administration, I think it makes sense to relook a lot of these institutions. It's not 1945 anymore. It's not 1989 anymore. We are at an inflection point in history, as the prior president, Joe Biden, has said. And so if we were designing the rules-based system from scratch right now, it would probably look very different. What are the new institutions we would set up? And so I think it does make sense to revitalize and adapt the system for a new era. And so in the cases where the Trump administration pulls out of agreements, but the Europeans still see value to them, like Paris, I do think it makes sense for other like-minded countries to continue those. And I think the Trump administration applying an America First principle would understand, okay, if Europeans think this is good for Europeans, they're obviously going to continue to pursue those arrangements.
Last question. The EU and the US obviously historically been allies despite periods of tension, and you've served in previous administrations, so I'm sure you've witnessed firsthand the fluctuation. But I think it's fair to say that we've been marked by strong interdependence, shared interests, and also common values. Do you believe that the nature of the relation is changing? We've heard many times the word transactional when it comes to EU-US. So is it fair to say that a transactional relationship is maybe coming into place, replacing one based on values?
Well, I think an important point I would make here is that the Trump administration and the America First movement isn't a unified movement. I think it is a pretty broad coalition that includes some traditional kind of internationalist Reaganite Republicans, and maybe you'd put Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, in that camp. I think others more in the Make America Great Again movement, maybe more skeptical of U.S. engagement. And I think President Trump has purposely built something of a team of rivals where you have these different views and they'll argue it out and he'll decide in the end. So I do think there are some who've been appointed who do see transatlantic relations, the shared values as important. And I think there are others who, take America First kind of literally, that, okay, there's America and there are a bunch of other countries, allies and adversaries, or developed and developing world, these other categories. Foreign policy experts might apply. They might apply less. Okay, Europe, Canada, they're all kind of the same. And so I think that will be an area of difference in the new administration.
maybe last point, how would you recommend for Europeans, whether it's businesses, civil society, policymakers that are sitting down with the US administration, what is a good way to communicate with them, to do strategy with them? Should the European approach change in some ways compared to what, the approach has been so far?
Yeah, I think I'd have two pieces of advice to Europeans. One, where Trump and the Trump administration is right about something, I'd say point that out. And so, for example, allied burden sharing, the idea that NATO allies need to spend more, was kind of controversial when Trump first started talking about it in 2016. Now, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think there is agreement that European allies need to do more. So saying, thanks for that, you're right, we do need to do more, and we have plans to do that. Second, I think maybe making a case about how the European Union can help the United States and help the Trump administration advance their goals. And the big one that comes to mind is China. I think many in the Trump administration do see China as the big long-term threat to the United States. I think some maybe think about too narrowly about the military threat, but if you think about the comprehensive challenge, there's an economic dimension, there's a technological dimension, and the United States can't do it on its own if it's going to compete with China in the economic space and the technological space. It's going to need Europe. I think we're going to need a unified approach. And so I think making that case, that we're going to help you with your China challenge, and really you can't deal with China without the European Union.
So just to close up, can we compete in a healthy and strategic way and cooperate at the same time?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Matthew. This has been a pleasure. Please, everyone, a round of applause for Matthew Coring.